I like to make American pie crust. And American pie crust is beautiful and flaky and buttery, but it takes a little bit longer than some tart crust recipes. So you see nothing here but an empty bowl, and there's a reason for that. It's because most of my ingredients are actually sitting in the refrigerator right now because I want them to be super duper cold. So here's what we need for our pie crust. We will need 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. I measured that and put it in the fridge. We need 2 teaspoons of sugar and 1 teaspoon of salt that we mix in with our flour, so it's mixed in, sitting in the refrigerator. We also need a whole cup of cold butter, really cold butter. I put my butter in the freezer. I want it to be that cold. Now I'm only going to leave it there for about 30 minutes, but still. And I also cut my butter into little cubes and then put it back in the freezer so that it's super duper cold. Finally, we need about 1/2 cup of ice water, and that's also sitting in the fridge with ice in it. The thing about pie crust, American pie crust, is everything has to be really cold because we don't want the butter to melt or get soft. We want chunks of cold butter in our pastry dough. So while all of that's cooling, the other thing that I've got now is we call these pie weights. They're these little ceramic balls that when we bake a pie crust that has nothing in it, it tends to like bubble up or get poofy, and we don't really want that. So we use in our tart or our pie dish, we put our crust in the bottom, our dough, and then we cover the dough with a piece of baking paper and we pour these little beads over it. If you don't have these beads, that's okay. You can also use like dried beans. I think you can use rice as well to weigh down the crust while it bakes in the oven. So if you have dried beans or rice laying around, you might want to grab that. Also, you'll want to have a tart pan ready for you. I'm going to use something that was sent to me from America, which is my 9-inch pie dish. I love my pie dish. It's a little bit deeper and a little bit smaller than a normal Belgian tart pan, which I prefer, but you can use like a normal tart pan for this as well. So I've got all those things ready, and I'm really just waiting on my ingredients to get extra cold before I mix them together. So we're going to start with our flour, salt, and sugar mixture, which I will get from the refrigerator now. And we're going to pour this into a very large mixing bowl to give us lots of room to work. The next thing that I need to get is I need to get my butter from the freezer and the tool that I'm going to use to break the butter up into the cold flour. So here I have very cold butter, and I have a potato masher. I'm going to start with that tool, which was in the refrigerator, and then I'll switch to my fork, but metal heats up in your hands, and so if I'm really serious about having nice cold butter, then I want to touch it with my hands as little as possible, which is why I'm using the masher. And my goal is just to get pea-sized pieces of butter mixed throughout the flour, and this will take a lot of strength because the butter's really cold, but that's a good thing. We want the butter to be cold. Now, if I feel that I've done about as much as I can with this, I'm just going to switch to my fork alone. And mix, cut. All right, I'm going to admit my impatience with this. I don't like to use my hands because my hands are so warm. However, if I do this and I refrigerate my flour again when I'm done, before I move on to the next step, it's really fine. You just don't want to do this for very long. So I'm doing this just long enough to break up some of this cold butter. All right, that is looking pretty good. It's okay to have 1 or 2 large chunks in there, but overall, we've got our chunks gone, but still lots and lots of cold material here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to save the bowl, but I want to dump my mixture into something smaller. It's going to fit into my refrigerator a little bit better. And I'm going to refrigerate this again for 20 or 30 minutes just to make sure that everything stays whole and solid and cold. Now that I've refrigerated my flour and butter mixture, I'm going to take those out of the refrigerator along with some ice cold water. And all that we're going to do all that we're going to do is add water to our flour and butter mixture, and we're just going to press it until it comes together, about 1/2 cup of this ice water, and then we'll be pressing the dough together into balls in order to refrigerate it yet again. So let me grab my ingredients. I'm just going to put my flour and butter back into the larger bowl. And I'm going to slowly drizzle about a tablespoon at a time. This is more water than I need, and that's okay. I just want to get this wet enough that it comes together. And I'm not going to use a lot in terms of my hands. Alright, so you can see we don't have any more dry stuff at all. Ooh, I'll take out that extra ice cube. We don't have any more dry stuff at all in our dough, so what I'm going to do now is I just need to clean my hand a bit, and then I'm going to grab my extra flour. I'm going to lightly flour my work surface, lightly. I don't need a lot at all. Spread that out, there we go. And then I'm going to take all of my dough here and turn this out. And I'm just going to press it into a ball. And I'll get a little bit of flour on the outside just so it doesn't stick. Now this is enough dough to actually make 2 pie crusts, because a lot of the time with American pies we put a crust on the top. Today we're not going to do that because I want a tart, which means no crust on the top. But what I will do is cut it in half to refrigerate it. I'll do that today with my knife. So we cut this in half. We just make 2 very quick discs out of our pie crust. That should be just fine. I might just sprinkle a teeny tiny bit of flour and rub that on the outside because I'm going to put this in plastic and then I'm going to throw it into my refrigerator for at least an hour to chill even more. So it has been 1 hour since our pie crust dough has been chilling. So I'm going to unwrap it and I'm going to work quickly and efficiently to roll my chilled dough into about a 12-inch circle. I'm going to flour my dough. I've already got flour on my counter. And basically, I want to try and get it flat but as untouched as possible. So that is looking pretty darn beautiful. So here's my pie dish, and you can see here that I've very gently folded my pie crust into quarters. And actually the reason I've done that is because then I can very gently unfold the pie crust to fit right into my pie plate. Now here comes the tricky bit. You have to make sure that your crust, that your dough, is pushed up properly against the pie plate. I do that by lifting my dough up and letting it fall onto the side and onto the bottom. And I do that because A, you don't want any air bubbles between your dough and your pie plate, but B, more importantly, you don't want like a bunch of fingerprints and squishy bits. And so you don't really want to like press it in there. You just kind of let gravity do it for you. Gravity and a little bit of light fingertip action here. So that looks like it's pretty well fit. Now we have to trim the edges. So I just use a small paring knife. Got to be careful with this. I find the edge of my pie dish and I just cut. But that's pretty darn beautiful. And then my last step, I've got my oven preheated to about 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius. My last step is to put my baking paper gently on top of my pie crust. And then I'm going to pour those baking beads, dry rice, or beans on top of the parchment paper. And just make sure that these are spread out evenly. We're going to bake this pie crust for about 15 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 degrees Celsius. And then we've actually got to take it out of the oven. If you want this to be a fully cooked crust, then you're going to remove the baking beads, poke some holes into the crust with a fork, and then bake it for another 15 minutes, and that should be a fully baked crust. If you want to do something called blind baking, which means you're going to fill it and then continue to bake it for another, I don't know, 45, 50 minutes with a filling in it, then you actually stop after that first 15 minutes, or maybe you put it in there for, like, say, 5 more minutes. We want a fully baked crust. So I'm going to go ahead, just going to kind of fold this over a little bit. I don't want it to press into my dough, but I don't want it to stick up in the air either. So just a little bit of folding there. There we go. Now I'm going to put this in the oven for about 15 minutes. So our pie crust has just come out of the oven, and of course my camcorder's run out of battery, so my husband is generously opting to be my camera right now. We have to work with very hot objects because this pie crust has to go back into the oven. So we're going to carefully and without touching the hot stuff, gather the corners of our parchment paper, and we're going to lift it off the pie crust and move it to this bowl that I have here. And all I'm going to do is just set it down because those have to cool. And if we try to dump them out, we can actually break the ceramic balls. I'm going to use my fork and just poke some holes into the bottom of my crust, which should stop any bubbles from forming. And then I'm going to put this back into the oven for approximately 15 minutes, and that will finish my pie crust baking.